Hey guys, today I will explain the Alcatraz escape. Let's start. The wind around Alcatraz Island never really stops. It moves across the cold waters of the San Francisco Bay, carrying the smell of salt and rust and something older, something heavy. In 1962, that wind wrapped itself around one of the most feared prisons in America, a place that was believed to be impossible to escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary stood alone on a rocky island, just over a mile from the city of San Francisco. From a distance, it did not look terrifying. In fact, on sunny days, tourists on boats would point at it like it was just another landmark. But the men locked inside its walls saw something different. They saw the end of hope. Alcatraz had a reputation. Before it became a federal prison, it had been a military fortress. Later, it held some of the most notorious criminals in American history. Men like Al Capone and George Machine Gun Kelly had once walked its corridors. The message was clear. This was where the government sent you when it wanted to make an example out of you. The island itself was part of the punishment. The water surrounding it was freezing year-round, often below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Strong currents moved unpredictably, capable of pulling even strong swimmers out toward the open Pacific Ocean. Guards reminded inmates daily that no one had ever successfully escaped and survived. The cold would claim them, the currents would drag them away. Or the sharks, though there were no man-eating sharks in the bay, the rumor was useful. Fear was a powerful tool. Inside the prison, life followed strict routine. Inmates woke early, they ate in silence, they worked, they returned to their cells. Each man had a small concrete box, 5 feet by 9 feet, with a steel bar front, a small sink with cold water, a toilet, and a narrow bed. Privacy did not exist. Freedom did not exist. Time moved slowly, but among the hundreds of men who passed through Alcatraz, there were a few who refused to believe the island was unbeatable. One of them was named Frank Morris. Frank Morris was not loud, he was not physically intimidating, but he was intelligent, extremely intelligent. Prison records would later describe him as having an IQ of 133. He had spent much of his life in and out of correctional institutions. Escaping had become something of a habit for him. Before arriving at Alcatraz, he had escaped from other prisons multiple times. When he was transferred to Alcatraz in January 1960, officials believed they were placing him somewhere escape-proof. They did not know they were placing him in the one location that would inspire his most famous attempt. Frank observed everything. He studied the guards' movements. He paid attention to meal schedules. He listened for the sounds of footsteps in the corridors. He noted how often cell inspections happened and how carefully the guards looked inside. He watched the tides from the yard. He felt the wind, and he began to think. Not far from him were two brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. The Anglin brothers were bank robbers from Florida. They were not considered violent men, but they had a history of escape attempts as well. Growing up, they had worked in the fields picking crops. They were strong. They could swim. As children, they had swum in the cold waters near their home for fun. That detail would matter later. At first, the three men were separated into different cells. But over time, they managed to be placed near each other in the same cell block, B block. Their cells were adjacent, separated only by narrow concrete walls and ventilation grills. Behind each cell was a small vent, about the size of a paperback book. The prison designers believed these vents were too small for a man to pass through. Above the vents ran an unused utility corridor, a dark space filled with pipes. To most inmates, those vents were nothing more than part of the wall. To Frank Morris, they were a possibility. The official escape attempt would later be dated June 11, 1962, but the planning began long before that night. It began in whispers. During work assignments in the yard or quietly in their cells after lights out, the men exchanged ideas. They spoke softly, careful not to attract attention. Another inmate, Alan West, would later claim he was also part of the plan. Whether he truly intended to escape with them remains debated, but he did help with some of the preparation. The problem was simple and terrifying. How do you get out of a fortress surrounded by water? The first step was the cell. Every night, guards walked past the bars and looked inside each cell with a flashlight. If they saw a body lying in bed, they moved on. They did not open each door. They did not check breathing. They relied on routine. Routine creates blindness. Frank realized that if he could make it appear as though he was asleep in bed, even when he wasn't, he might gain hours before anyone noticed. But what could replace a human head in a dimly lit cell? That question lingered for weeks. Meanwhile, the men began working on the vents. Using makeshift tools, including spoons stolen from the dining hall, they slowly chipped away at the crumbling concrete around the vent openings. The cement used in the 1910s construction had weakened over time due to moisture and salt air. The men covered the noise by playing music during the evening recreation hour. One inmate had an accordion. The sound masked the scraping. It was slow, exhausting work. Night after night, they scraped and chipped. They hid the debris in their pockets and shook it out during yard time. They placed cardboard painted to match the wall over the growing holes so guards would not notice. Weeks turned into months. Behind the cells in that dark utility corridor, they began assembling something that had never been attempted before at Alcatraz, a raft. They stole raincoats from the prison laundry, over 50 of them. Using heat from steam pipes, they fused the rubber material together, creating waterproof seams. They constructed life vests. They fashioned a small concertina-style accordion pump to inflate the raft. Every piece was built in secret. Every movement carried risk. If discovered, they would be sent to solitary confinement, the hole, a place of darkness and isolation that broke men psychologically. But they continued. By early June 1962, the vent holes were large enough to crawl through. The cardboard covers remained convincing. The raft was ready. The life vests were prepared. Only one thing remained: the heads. Using soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, and stolen prison materials, the men crafted dummy heads. They shaped noses and cheekbones carefully. They painted skin tones using materials stolen from the prison art supplies. They even used real human hair collected from the prison barbershop floor and glued it onto the figures. In the dim light of a flashlight beam, under a blanket, those heads looked disturbingly real. They placed the fake heads on their pillows, arranged blankets beneath them to mimic the shape of a sleeping body, and positioned them carefully so the shadows looked natural. The plan was set for the night of June 11, 1962. As the sun lowered over the bay that evening, the wind felt sharper than usual. The water below churned quietly, as if aware. Inside B Block, the men waited. They had no guarantee the raft would survive, no certainty the currents would allow them to reach land, no promise they would not freeze in the water. They only knew one thing: staying meant dying slowly inside those concrete walls. Lights out came, footsteps echoed, flashlights passed across bars, the guards moved on. And somewhere in the silence of that prison, 3 men began to climb through holes they had carved with stolen spoons. Behind them, in their beds, papier-mâché faces stared up at the ceiling. For a few hours, Alcatraz would believe they were still asleep, but by morning, the illusion would collapse. And the world would begin asking a question that remains unanswered even today: did they survive? The night of June 11, 1962, felt like any other night on Alcatraz. The final count had been completed. Guards had walked past the rows of cells in B Block, shining flashlights through the bars. They saw what they expected to see: still bodies under gray prison blankets, faces pressed into thin pillows, silence filling the concrete corridors. Satisfied, they moved on. Behind the bars of cell 138, Frank Morris waited. He listened carefully. He had learned the rhythm of the prison. He knew how long the guards lingered. He knew the sound of boots against the floor and the metallic jingle of keys. When the footsteps faded, when the heavy door at the end of the corridor shut with a dull echo, he moved, slowly. Carefully, he removed the vent cover behind his sink, the painted cardboard that had hidden months of work. The hole was just large enough now. He slid out of his bed, leaving behind the dummy head perfectly placed beneath the blanket. In the darkness, it looked almost human. In the neighboring cells, John and Clarence Anglin were doing the same. They had practiced this moment in their minds countless times. No sudden movements, no panic. Every second mattered. Frank climbed onto the sink, squeezed his thin body through the jagged opening, and entered the narrow utility corridor behind the cells. Dust filled the air. It smelled of rust and old pipes. Above him was a vent that led up toward the cell house ceiling. One by one, the Anglin brothers followed. There had been a 4th man involved in the early planning, Alan West. But on this night, something went wrong for him. His vent opening was not large enough. The concrete had crumbled in the wrong way. He struggled in the darkness, trying to widen it. He whispered urgently. He scraped at the edges, but it was too late. The others could not risk waiting. They made a decision that would haunt West for the rest of his life. They left without him. Frank and the Anglin brothers climbed up through a plumbing vent and emerged onto the top of the cell house. The air outside hit them like ice. The wind whipped across the roof, sharp and relentless. Below them, the black water of the bay shifted in slow, powerful currents. For a moment they froze, not from cold, but from the weight of the reality. They were outside. They were no longer inside their cells, but the most dangerous part still lay ahead. They moved quietly across the roof, careful not to dislodge loose gravel. They slid down a kitchen vent pipe and crossed the prison yard in the shadows. Searchlights swept across the grounds in slow arcs. The men pressed themselves against walls, timing their movements between beams of light. Alcatraz was designed to remove opportunity. Every angle had been considered, every weakness addressed. Or so officials believed. Reaching the northeastern shoreline of the island, they hid behind a workshop where they had previously stashed their homemade raft and life vests. The raft, constructed from more than 50 stolen raincoats, lay folded tightly. It had taken months to assemble, sealing the rubber with steam pipes and prison heat. Now under the open sky, they worked quickly. They inflated the raft using their handmade pump, a small concertina device crafted from scrap materials. The rubber expanded slowly. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the night, even faint sounds felt dangerous. The wind carried distant city noises from San Francisco. Lights flickered across the bay. So close, yet impossibly far. It was around 11:30 p.m. when they pushed off. The water was shockingly cold. Historians later estimated the temperature that night to be around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to numb limbs within minutes, cold enough to paralyze muscles. Strong swimmers had drowned in these waters before, but the Anglin brothers had grown up swimming in cold rivers in Florida. They understood water, they understood how to float, how to conserve energy. Frank Morris, thin and determined, trusted calculation over fear. They aimed toward a spot north of the island, toward Marin Headlands, timing their departure with the outgoing tide. According to later investigations, if they left at the right moment, the current could carry them toward land rather than out to sea. But tides are unpredictable. And the bay does not forgive mistakes. Back inside the prison, time moved normally. Midnight passed, the guards conducted routine checks, flashlights shone briefly into cells. The dummy heads held their shape, shadows worked in the escapees' favor. At around 1:30 a.m., a guard passed by Morris's cell. He noticed nothing unusual. The head on the pillow appeared real enough in the dim light. Hours slipped by, dawn slowly approached. At approximately 7:00 a.m. on June 12, 1962, guard Frank P. Klein approached cell 138 for the morning count. He tapped the bars lightly. Morris did not move. Klein hit the bars harder, still nothing. Irritated, he reached through the bars to shake the prisoner awake. The head rolled off the pillow and hit the floor, cracking open. Inside, bits of soap and toilet paper spilled out. For a split second, the guard did not understand what he was looking at. Then the realization hit. The alarm sounded immediately. Whistles pierced the morning air. Guards rushed into B block. They found the enlarged vent holes. They climbed into the utility corridor. They discovered the workshop where the raft had been assembled. Scraps of raincoat material remained. Footprints marked the dust. The prison went into full lockdown. Boats were dispatched into the bay. Helicopters circled overhead. The Coast Guard joined the search. Patrol cars lined the shoreline. Officers scanned the water for bodies, but they found nothing. No raft, no life vests, no men. Later that day, bits of debris were discovered, a small piece of rubber material floating near Angel Island, a makeshift paddle fragment, but there were no bodies recovered. Officials from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were called in. The case quickly became national news. Had the men drowned? Or had they accomplished what no one had ever done before, escaped from Alcatraz and survived? Publicly, authorities leaned toward drowning. The water was too cold, the currents too strong. The distance too great, but privately, doubts began to grow, because the timing of the tide that night might actually have worked in their favor. And as investigators began retracing every step of the escape, interviewing inmates, reconstructing the raft, studying tide charts, the story grew more complicated. What they uncovered next would challenge the prison's confidence, and it would turn a failed prison break into one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. Because in the days that followed, strange evidence began to appear along the shoreline. By mid-morning on June 12, 1962, the quiet routine of Alcatraz had turned into controlled chaos. Sirens echoed across the island. Armed guards lined the shoreline. Boats from the prison and the Coast Guard cut through the gray waters of the bay. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades slicing through the wind as officers scanned the surface below. The story spread quickly to the mainland. In downtown San Francisco, newspapers rushed to print special editions. Radio stations interrupted programming. The words Alcatraz escape sent a chill through the public. Because Alcatraz was not supposed to fail. Inside the prison, officers retraced every step the men had taken. They examined the cells carefully. The vent holes were larger than anyone had imagined possible. Chunks of crumbling concrete lay hidden behind sinks. The painted cardboard covers were so convincing that, in dim light, they blended almost perfectly with the walls. Then there were the heads. Each dummy had been crafted with disturbing detail. The skin tone matched, the hair was real, the eyelashes were shaped, even the facial angles were carefully molded. Investigators would later say that in the low light of a quick inspection, the heads would easily pass as sleeping inmates. This had not been rushed work. This had been patient, precise, calculated. In the unused utility corridor above the cells, officers found evidence of long-term preparation. Scraps of raincoat material were discovered, bits of thread. A crude musical instrument modified into a pumping device. It was clear that the men had used steam pipes to heat seal the rubber raincoats together. They had built a raft large enough to hold 3 grown men, and they had done it without being detected. The investigation quickly moved beyond the prison walls. The case was officially handed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agents arrived on the island and began collecting evidence. Their first question was simple: how far could 3 men realistically travel in those waters? Experts were consulted, tide charts were reviewed. The night of June 11 had featured a strong outgoing current around 11:30 p.m. If the men had launched at exactly the right time, the current could have carried them north toward the Marin headlands. If they had misjudged by even 30 minutes, however, the tide would have pulled them west, out toward the open Pacific Ocean. The margin for survival was razor thin. Search teams combed the bay for days, boats dragged the water for bodies, helicopters searched from above. Officers walked the beaches of Angel Island and the Marin shoreline. On June 14, a break in the case came. A bundle of rubber material was discovered floating near Angel Island. It appeared to be part of a raincoat, the same kind issued to inmates at Alcatraz. Soon after, a makeshift wooden paddle fragment was found. Then, a small piece of raft material turned up along the shore. To some investigators, this confirmed their belief. The raft had fallen apart. The men had drowned, but something did not fit. No bodies surfaced. In cold water drownings, bodies often rise within days due to decomposition gases. The bay currents could scatter remains, yes. But extensive searches found nothing. Not a single trace of Frank Morris, not John Anglin, not Clarence Anglin, and there was another detail. The Anglin brothers had grown up near water in Florida. Their family later stated that the brothers were excellent swimmers. They had often swum in cold conditions as children. Frank Morris, though smaller, had a history of careful planning and endurance. These were not impulsive men. Back inside Alcatraz, Alan West was questioned extensively. He told investigators that he had intended to escape with the others, but could not widen his vent hole in time. According to his account, the plan was to launch the raft toward Angel Island first, rest there briefly, and then continue toward the mainland under cover of darkness. His testimony gave the FBI valuable insight into the plan's design. It also raised new possibilities. If the men had reached Angel Island, they could have hidden there until dawn. The island had wooded areas and hills that might provide cover. From there, reaching the Marin headlands would be a shorter journey. Investigators studied wind speed that night. Approximately 10 to 15 miles per hour, the air temperature had been cool but not freezing. Water temperature remained the biggest threat. One FBI simulation suggested that if the men launched at precisely 11:30 p.m., they would likely drift past Angel Island and reach Horseshoe Bay near the Golden Gate Bridge by early morning. That location was remote enough to allow escape into the surrounding hills. The possibility changed everything. Because if they reached land, even exhausted and freezing, survival became much more likely. And then something else happened. In the weeks following the escape, the Anglin family in Florida reportedly received a Christmas card signed John and Clarence. It was unsigned officially, but the handwriting resembled the brothers. The family later claimed they received other mysterious messages over the years. The FBI investigated these claims but could not conclusively verify them. Meanwhile, on Alcatraz Island, something else was unfolding. The escape had embarrassed federal authorities. The prison's reputation had been built on its inescapability. Now that reputation was cracked. Just months later, in 1963, the government announced that Alcatraz would close permanently. Officially, it was due to high operational costs and deteriorating infrastructure, but privately, many believed the escape played a role. The prison that could not be beaten had been beaten, or at least challenged. The FBI continued its investigation for 17 years. Agents followed leads across the country. They tracked down reported sightings in Brazil. They investigated rumors in Mexico. They compared fingerprints. They interviewed former associates, but no arrests were ever made. In 1979, the FBI officially closed the case, concluding that the men likely drowned in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. Yet even that conclusion came with uncertainty. Because years later, new evidence would emerge: a photograph from South America, a mysterious letter sent to authorities, and a quiet admission from U.S. Marshals that the case was not truly over. As the waves continued to crash against the rocks of Alcatraz, the question refused to disappear. Did three determined men outsmart one of the most secure prisons in America? Or did the bay claim them, leaving behind nothing but fragments of rubber and unanswered doubt? The next clue would surface decades later, far from California, and it would reopen a mystery that many believed was buried beneath the cold water. Years passed. The island of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed in 1963, just 1 year after the escape. The cells were emptied. The iron doors no longer slammed shut each night. Tourists would eventually walk the same corridors where men once whispered in the dark, but the mystery of June 11, 1962 did not fade. Even after the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially closed its case in 1979, something about the escape refused to sit quietly in history. It lingered, it resurfaced, it unsettled. For the families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, the story never ended. The Anglin family, living in Florida, insisted that John and Clarence were alive. They claimed the brothers had always been resourceful, tough, capable of surviving harsh conditions. Their childhood had not been easy. They grew up working farms, picking crops, swimming in rivers, enduring heat and cold without complaint. They were not reckless men, the family said. They were patient. Then came one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the entire case. In the 1970s, a photograph surfaced. It showed two men standing in Brazil, side by side, smiling at the camera. The photo was reportedly taken in 1975 on a rural farm. According to a family friend, the two men in the picture were John and Clarence Anglin. The FBI examined the photograph carefully. Facial recognition technology at the time was limited, but agents compared ear shapes, facial structures, and height proportions. Some experts believed the resemblance was strong. Others were not convinced. The problem was simple. The image was not clear enough to prove anything, but it was clear enough to create doubt. If the brothers had reached land in 1962, they would have needed help, money, new identities, a way to disappear. Investigators looked into whether anyone could have assisted them. They discovered that the Anglins had connections, friends from previous prison sentences, associates who might have been willing to help. Frank Morris, too, had a history of making contacts during his years behind bars. He was intelligent, adaptable. If anyone could vanish quietly into the background, it might have been him. But surviving the escape was only the first step. The real challenge would have been staying hidden. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, sightings were reported across the United States and even abroad. Most were dismissed quickly, a man with a similar face. A rumor passed from one town to another, none of it solid enough to confirm survival, yet one agency never closed the case completely. The United States Marshals Service maintained jurisdiction over Alcatraz escapees. Unlike the FBI, which eventually archived the file, the Marshals kept it open. For them, the case remained active. Because there was no proof of death, no bodies, no confirmed remains, no verified graves. In 2013, more than 50 years after the escape, a new development shocked investigators. The San Francisco Police Department received a letter. It was handwritten, carefully composed. The author claimed to be John Anglin. In the letter, the writer stated that he, Clarence, and Frank had survived the escape. He claimed they reached land that night and later traveled to Mexico. He wrote that Frank Morris had died in 2005 and Clarence in 2008. The writer himself said he was suffering from cancer and wanted to negotiate a deal for medical treatment in exchange for surrendering. The letter was turned over to federal authorities. Handwriting experts analyzed it. DNA tests were attempted on the envelope, though results were inconclusive. Investigators faced a difficult question: was this a hoax? Or was it the confession of a man who had lived in hiding for half a century? The letter included small details about the escape that were not widely known to the public at the time. That gave it credibility, but it also lacked verifiable proof. Agents reopened interviews. They reviewed old files. They re-examined tied data from 1962 using modern computer simulations. In 2014, a Dutch team of scientists conducted an independent tidal simulation study. Their findings suggested that if the men had left at approximately 11:30 p.m., as believed, the currents would likely have carried them toward the Marin headlands rather than out to sea. In other words, survival was possible, not guaranteed. That single word shifted decades of assumptions. Meanwhile, historians began reevaluating Alcatraz itself. The prison had long been portrayed as escape-proof, but records showed that 36 men had attempted to escape over its 29 years as a federal penitentiary. Most were caught, some were shot. Several drowned, but 5 men were officially listed as missing and presumed drowned. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and 2 others from earlier attempts presumed. It was a word built on probability, not certainty. On tour of Alcatraz Island, guides now tell visitors about the dummy heads, the raincoat raft, the spoon-carved vents. Tourists stand inside the small concrete cells and try to imagine squeezing through those narrow openings. They look out across the water toward San Francisco, so close that the city lights almost feel reachable. On calm days, the distance looks manageable. On windy nights, it looks impossible. The mystery endures because both realities seem true at the same time. The evidence suggests drowning. The evidence also suggests survival. There is no final photograph of bodies, no recovered raft. No confirmed sighting, only fragments, possibilities, letters, a faded photograph in Brazil, and one haunting image remains: 3 men pushing off into black water, trusting calculation over fear. In the decades since, experts have debated endlessly. Some argue the cold would have paralyzed them within minutes. Others point to documented cases of swimmers surviving similar conditions. Some believe the raft debris proves it broke apart. Others argue that debris washing ashore does not prove death, only that part of the raft detached. The truth rests somewhere in the darkness of that night, but as more time passes, the mystery grows quieter, not because it is solved, but because the men, if alive, would now be elderly or gone. Still, the file remains open with the U.S. Marshals. Still, the question remains unanswered. And in the next chapter, we will look deeper into the psychology of the escape itself, what drives a man to risk certain death for a chance at freedom, and whether Frank Morris had been planning something even more complex than investigators realized. Because what they discovered about his past suggests this was not just an escape, it may have been a final masterpiece of patience and intelligence. To understand the escape from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, you have to understand the mind of Frank Morris. He was not a loud man, not a violent one. He did not seek attention in the yard or challenge guards openly. In many ways, that made him more dangerous. Frank Morris had been in institutions for most of his life. Orphaned at a young age, he moved through foster homes and juvenile facilities before graduating to adult prisons. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, he had already escaped from other correctional institutions multiple times. Not attempted, escaped. Each time he had been caught eventually. But each time he learned something. He learned how guards think, how they grow comfortable with routine, how systems built on discipline can slowly become predictable. He learned that prisons rely on repetition, the same counts, the same patrol routes, the same procedures day after day. And routine over time creates blind spots. When Morris arrived on the island, officials believed they had finally found a place he could not outsmart. Alcatraz was different, surrounded by water, isolated, cold. Designed specifically for inmates who caused trouble elsewhere, but Morris did not see a fortress. He saw a structure built by human hands, and anything built by human hands can contain flaws. In B Block, he quietly observed everything. He noticed how old the building was. The prison had originally been constructed in the early 1900s as a military facility before becoming a federal penitentiary in 1934. Moisture from the sea air had slowly weakened parts of the concrete. The ventilation grills in the cells were not reinforced steel, they were surrounded by aging cement. Most inmates ignored these details. Morris did not. Psychologically, there is something important here. Escape was not just about freedom. For Morris, it may have been about control. In prison, control is stripped away, every movement dictated, every action observed, but planning an escape returns control to the inmate. It creates purpose. It replaces helplessness with strategy. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were different personalities. They were practical men, strong, quiet, raised in poverty. Their crimes, mostly bank robberies, were motivated by money rather than chaos. They were known for following rules inside prison to avoid drawing attention. That combination mattered. Morris brought intelligence and patience. The Anglins brought strength and teamwork, and together they created something rare inside a maximum security prison: trust. Trust is difficult to build in a place like Alcatraz. Informants existed, guards listened carefully. One wrong conversation could send a man to solitary confinement, so they spoke in fragments. During music hour, during work shifts, in whispers after lights out, the escape was not rushed. It unfolded over nearly 6 months. 6 months of scraping concrete with stolen spoons. 6 months of hiding debris in pockets and scattering it in the yard. 6 months of crafting dummy heads with soap and toothpaste. 6 months of stealing raincoats from the laundry one at a time so no one would notice a large shortage. That level of patience reveals something important about Morris's psychology. He was not desperate in the emotional sense. He was disciplined. He understood delayed gratification. He knew that success depended on precision, not speed. Investigators later recreated the escape tools and discovered something remarkable. The spoons used to chip away the concrete were not reinforced. They were ordinary dining utensils. The cement around the vents had simply weakened enough over decades that slow, steady pressure worked. This was not brute force. It was time and persistence, but there is another layer to consider. Morris had to know the risks, the water temperature, the currents, the possibility of being shot if caught crossing the yard, the high chance of drowning. He was not impulsive, which suggests he believed survival was realistic. That belief may have been based on research. Some inmates had access to library materials. Tide patterns in the bay were not secret knowledge. Fishermen understood them. Locals understood them. If Morris observed the water long enough, he might have identified predictable patterns. He may have known that leaving during a specific outgoing tide window could carry them north. It was a gamble, yes, but perhaps not a blind one. There is also the emotional dimension. Imagine lying in that 5 by 9 foot cell night after night, listening to the wind, hearing foghorns in the distance, watching lights from San Francisco flicker just over a mile away. Close enough to see, too far to touch. Hope becomes dangerous in that environment. It can either break a man or fuel him. For Morris and the Anglins, it fueled them. By the time June 11 arrived, the plan was no longer a dream. It was a rehearsed operation. They had practiced climbing through the vents. They had tested the raft seams. They had timed guard patrols. And still, something could have gone wrong. The fact that Alan West failed to escape due to his vent not being large enough shows how fragile the plan truly was. A few inches of concrete nearly changed history. If Morris had hesitated that night, if a guard had lingered a few seconds longer, if the raft had torn immediately upon entering the water, the story would be simple. 3 bodies recovered. Case closed, but that is not what happened. Instead, uncertainty took over. Psychologists who later studied the case suggested that Morris likely accepted the possibility of death as part of the equation. In some ways, that acceptance may have made him calmer. When the worst outcome is already acknowledged, fear loses some of its power. For a man who had spent his life confined, drowning in cold water may have seemed less terrifying than spending decades behind steel bars. That mindset is difficult to understand from the outside. But inside Alcatraz, perspective changes. As investigators continued reviewing Morris's past, they found no evidence of close family ties, no clear destination waiting for him. That raises another question: where would he go if he survived? Some believe he may have planned to travel south toward Mexico or even South America. The later photograph from Brazil fueled that theory. Others believe he would have stayed quiet inside the United States under a false identity, blending into society. But blending requires documentation, employment, silence. It requires discipline over decades, and if any of the three men possessed that discipline, it was likely Morris. Still, survival in the water remains the central mystery. The bay in June is not forgiving. Hypothermia can set in quickly, muscles cramp, breathing becomes difficult. But with a functioning raft and life vests, their chances improved significantly. The escape was not a reckless swim, it was a calculated crossing. And in the next part of this story, we will examine that crossing more closely, the science of the currents, the timing of the tide, and the narrow window that may have carried three men toward freedom instead of death. Because the truth of that night may not rest in the prison walls at all, it may rest in the movement of the water itself. The water around Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary has always been part of its legend. Guards used it as a warning. Inmates feared it like a living thing, cold, dark, unpredictable. But on the night of June 11, 1962, that water was not just an obstacle. It was either a death sentence or the final piece of a carefully calculated plan. To understand what may have happened after Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers pushed off from the northeast shore of the island, you have to understand the tides of San Francisco Bay. The bay is not a calm lake. It is connected directly to the Pacific Ocean through the Golden Gate. Twice a day, massive volumes of water rush in and out, pulled by the gravitational forces of the moon and sun. These tidal movements create powerful currents that shift direction with precision. In simple terms, the bay breathes. When the tide flows out toward the ocean, the current pulls westward. When it flows in, it pulls eastward toward the inner bay. The timing of that breath mattered more than anything else. For years after the escape, officials believed the men had been swept out toward the Pacific Ocean. The water temperature, hovering around 54 degrees Fahrenheit, would have caused hypothermia within minutes. Muscles would weaken, coordination would fail. Even strong swimmers could lose consciousness quickly. That assumption shaped the early investigation. But decades later, when researchers began analyzing the tidal charts from June 11, 1962 more closely, a different picture emerged. If the men launched at approximately 11:30 p.m., as Alan West claimed was the plan, the outgoing tide would have been slowing. In fact, around midnight, the current would begin shifting northward toward the Marin headlands. That shift created a narrow window. A small corridor of moving water that could carry a floating raft toward land instead of out to sea. In 2014, scientists conducted a computer simulation of the exact tidal patterns from that night. Using modern modeling software, they recreated the wind speed, water temperature, and current direction from historical weather data. The results were striking. If the escapees left between 11:00 and 11:30 p.m., they likely would have drifted northeast toward Horseshoe Bay, near the Golden Gate Bridge. If they left after midnight, they likely would have been carried west, out toward the Pacific. 30 minutes, that was the difference between survival and disappearance. This detail changed the tone of the entire case, because it suggested the men did not need to fight the current, they needed to ride it. And that is exactly the kind of calculation Frank Morris might have made. Consider what they had built. The raft was not a simple flotation device. It was constructed from over 50 raincoats, carefully heat-sealed to prevent leaks. The seams were pressed together using steam pipes in the prison workshop. The life vests were layered for insulation and buoyancy. They had even crafted makeshift paddles. This was not the work of men planning a desperate swim. This was the work of men planning a controlled crossing. Still, the cold remained a serious threat. At 54 degrees, the average person might survive 1 to 3 hours before losing muscle control. But with insulation from the rubber raft and limited exposure to direct water, survival time could extend. And if they reached shore within an hour, the equation changed completely. Let's imagine the moment. The raft inflates. The three men push off quietly into black water. The island begins to shrink behind them. The lights of Alcatraz fade as they drift into open darkness. The wind presses against the rubber surface. They paddle cautiously, not fighting the tide but adjusting slightly to maintain direction. Below them, the current moves like a slow river. The city lights shimmer to the south. The dark outline of Angel Island rises to the east. And to the north, barely visible, the hills of Marin wait in shadow. No shouting, no alarms yet. Just the sound of water touching rubber. If they timed it correctly, the current would begin carrying them north and east. The raft would move faster than they could paddle alone. Within 45 minutes to an hour, they could approach the shoreline near Horseshoe Bay, cold, exhausted, but alive. But that scenario depends entirely on timing, and timing is uncertain. There were no clocks on the shoreline marking the exact second they entered the water. Alan West's testimony suggested 11:30 p.m., but he was not there. He was left behind in his cell. And there is another possibility investigators considered. What if they reached Angel Island first? Angel Island sits closer to Alcatraz than the Marin headlands. Some experts believe the current might have carried them there temporarily before shifting again. If so, the men could have hidden until early morning and then crossed the shorter distance to the mainland. Search teams did comb Angel Island in the days after the escape. They found nothing conclusive, no footprints, no clothing, no clear signs of shelter, but dense vegetation and rugged terrain could have hidden traces easily. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Meanwhile, debris from the raft began washing ashore. A fragment of rubber near Angel Island, a small piece of paddle. These findings were used to support the drowning theory, but debris alone proves only that part of the raft separated. It does not prove the men were on it when it broke. It does not prove they were not already on land, and that is where the mystery deepens, because if the men did reach shore, they would have needed immediate action. They would be soaked, hypothermic. Shivering uncontrollably, they would need dry clothing, shelter, possibly assistance. Could someone have been waiting? There is no confirmed evidence of a pickup boat that night. No witness reported seeing a suspicious craft near the island, but nighttime visibility in the bay is limited. If a friend knew the approximate escape window, they might have waited near the Marin coastline, or perhaps no one waited at all. Perhaps 3 exhausted men crawled onto a dark beach, hid in the hills until dawn, and began walking. The hills north of the Golden Gate are rugged, sparse in places. It would not have been impossible to disappear there, especially in 1962. And as dawn broke on June 12, search boats scanned the water around Alcatraz. They searched the wrong direction first. Because most assumed the men would have drifted west. By the time tidal recalculations were considered, hours had passed, hours that could mean everything. In the next part of this story, we will follow the investigation beyond the water, into the interviews, the family connections, the mysterious Christmas cards, and the growing suspicion that perhaps the 3 men were not victims of the bay, but masters of it. Because sometimes the greatest trick is not escaping, it is convincing the world you never made it. In the days after the escape, the search for Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers stretched far beyond the cold waters surrounding Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Boats had combed the bay. Helicopters had scanned the shoreline. Coast Guard crews had watched for bodies rising to the surface. Nothing. As the physical search slowed, the investigation shifted direction. If the men had survived, they would need help. They would need money, transportation, clothing, and new identities. No one disappears alone. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began interviewing family members. Agents traveled to Florida to speak with the Anglin family. They asked difficult questions. Did the brothers have outside contacts? Had they hinted at escape plans during visits? Did anyone suspicious show up around June 1962? The family insisted they had no knowledge of a detailed plan. But they also insisted on something else. They believed John and Clarence were alive. Their belief did not come from blind hope alone. It came from small, unsettling details that followed in the years after the escape. Every year, their mother received flowers anonymously on Mother's Day. Every Christmas, a card would arrive, signed simply John or Clarence. The handwriting resembled theirs, the spelling quirks matched. The family claimed the tone felt personal, not like something written by a stranger. The FBI examined these cards. They compared handwriting samples from prison records. Some analysts said similarities were present. Others argued the samples were too limited to be conclusive. Then there were sightings. In the late 1960s, 2 men reportedly attended the Anglin family's father's funeral in Florida. Witnesses claimed the men stood at a distance, wearing women's wigs to disguise themselves. They did not approach the grave, they did not speak, they simply watched. Law enforcement investigated the claim but could not confirm it definitively. Memory fades, emotions blur facts. Still, the image lingered, 2 brothers watching their family from the shadows, unable to step forward. Meanwhile, agents turned their focus to Frank Morris. Unlike the Anglins, Morris had fewer family connections. He was more isolated. His childhood in foster care left him without a strong support system. That made survival more complicated. If he had reached land, where would he go? Some investigators believed he may have relied on prison contacts, former associates who owed him favors. Others suspected he could have traveled south quickly, heading toward Mexico before authorities could establish roadblocks. In 1962, identification systems were far less advanced than today. There were no digital databases linking fingerprints instantly across states, no surveillance cameras on every corner, no facial recognition software. A man with cash and a low profile could disappear more easily than we imagine now. The FBI tracked down former cellmates. They questioned known associates. They followed leads from anonymous tips. One report suggested the men had been seen in Mexico. Another placed them in Rio de Janeiro. Yet another claimed they were working on a farm in South America. Most leads collapsed under scrutiny. But one piece of evidence would not disappear: the photograph. In the 1970s, a family friend of the Anglins traveled to Brazil. While there, he took a photograph of two men on a rural farm. Years later, he showed the image to the Anglin family. They believed immediately that the men were John and Clarence. The faces were older, weathered by sun and time, but the resemblance was striking. When the FBI examined the photo, they did not dismiss it outright. Forensic analysts compared ear shapes, nose structures, and facial proportions. Ears are particularly useful in identification because they remain relatively consistent over time. Some experts concluded the men in the photograph were likely the Anglin brothers. Others said the image quality prevented certainty. It was not proof, but it was not nothing. Then came something even more dramatic. In 2013, more than 50 years after the escape, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department. It was handwritten, carefully phrased, and claimed to be from John Anglin. The letter stated that all three men had survived the escape. It claimed they reached land that night and later made their way to Mexico. It said Frank Morris had died in 2005 and Clarence in 2008. The writer, allegedly John, claimed he was living in California under a new identity and was suffering from cancer. He offered to surrender in exchange for medical treatment and limited prison time. The letter was forwarded to federal authorities. The United States Marshals Service took interest immediately. They tested the envelope for DNA. Partial results were obtained, but they were not strong enough for a definitive match. Handwriting experts analyzed the script. Some similarities appeared between the letter and John Anglin's prison records, but again, it was inconclusive. The letter included small details about the escape that were not widely publicized. That detail gave investigators pause. Was this a hoax by someone who studied the case deeply, or was it a dying man seeking closure? The marshals refused to close the file. Unlike the FBI, which officially ended its investigation in 1979, the U.S. Marshals continue to pursue leads related to Alcatraz escapees until the fugitives reach 100 years of age. Frank Morris would have turned 100 in 2026. The Anglin brothers would have reached that milestone soon after. That means, even today, the case technically remains open. And there is one more detail that complicates everything. In 2018, investigators revealed that the 2013 letter had been received earlier, but not made public immediately. They had quietly reopened aspects of the investigation. They reanalyzed the Brazil photograph using modern facial recognition software. The results showed a high likelihood of a match between the men in the photo and the Anglin brothers. High likelihood, not certainty. The mystery continues because every piece of evidence exists in that narrow space between possible and proven. No bodies were ever recovered, no verified graves, no confirmed death certificates. Only fragments of rubber, a faded photograph, anonymous flowers, a handwritten letter. And the knowledge that three intelligent, patient men once slipped through holes carved with spoons and vanished into the dark. In the next part, we will look deeper into the official conclusions, why authorities leaned toward drowning, the legal reasoning behind closing the case, and the questions that still trouble investigators decades later. Because sometimes what a government chooses to conclude tells its own story. The sky above the valley had turned the color of bruised steel. Ira stood at the ridge long after the others had retreated to the broken watchtower. Wind dragged at her cloak, snapping it like a torn banner, but she didn't feel the cold. All she could hear was the echo of the cavern collapsing behind them, the sound of stone ceiling secrets that had slept for centuries, and the sound of the whisper. It had not been a voice in the way human voices were. It had not formed words in her ears. It had formed them inside her bones. You are the last door. She closed her eyes now and pressed her palm against the scar at her collarbone. The mark had changed again. It had once resembled a crescent. Now thin branching lines radiated from it like cracks in ice. Below her the valley lay still. No torches, no patrols, no movement from the Ashen Guard, too still. They're not gone, she murmured. They're waiting, Cale answered from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved like someone who had spent his life avoiding being seen. His dark hair was tied back now, revealing the pale line of a fresh cut across his cheek. He followed her gaze down into the valley. They'll want what was in that cavern, he said. And they'll know we were there. Ira didn't answer, because she wasn't certain the Ashen Guard had been searching for what she had found. She turned, finally looking at him. When it spoke, she said quietly, "Did you hear anything?" Cale's jaw tightened. No, he didn't elaborate. That frightened her more than if he had. Inside the ruined watchtower, Lysa knelt over a spread of parchment maps, weighted by broken pieces of stone. The tower's upper levels had long ago collapsed, leaving only a circular chamber open to the sky. Rain began to fall through the broken ring of walls, dampening ink and hair alike. Torrin paced. He had been a captain once. He paced like he was still waiting for orders to give. "We can't stay here," he said for the 5th time. "They'll sweep the ridges by morning." "And go where?" Lysa snapped without looking up. "West is ash fields, north is flooded ravines, east is Guard territory, south is the sea," Torrin finished. Silence followed. The sea meant ships. Ships meant the old routes meant the Isles. Ira stepped into the chamber, water dripping from her cloak. "The Isles are not abandoned," she said. 3 pairs of eyes lifted to her. "The order fell there," Torrin said carefully. "Yes, which means the Guard won't risk it. Which means they won't expect us to." Cale leaned against the cracked wall. "Assuming the Isles haven't swallowed themselves whole." "They haven't," Ira said. She didn't know how she knew that, but she did. They left before dawn. Mist clung to the valley like a burial shroud. They moved along deer paths and broken stone ledges, descending into lowlands choked with charred tree trunks, the remnants of the burn years. Ira walked in front. The whisper had not spoken again, but the air felt thinner, sharper, as if every breath carried a hidden edge. By midday, they reached the old causeway. It had once been a trade road, white stone spanning marshland toward the southern coast. Now sections had collapsed into black water. Reeds grew through cracked slabs. Birds scattered at their approach. Torrin crouched and examined a set of tracks pressed into soft earth. 3 riders, he said. Heavy armor, 2 hours ahead. The Guard, Cale said. Ira felt it before she saw it, the faint tremor beneath her feet. A rhythm, not hooves, something else. The marsh water began to ripple. Lysa stepped back. "That's not wind." The ripples spread outward in perfect circles. Reeds bowed and snapped. The black water bulged upward as though something massive stirred beneath it. Ira's scar burned. "You're the last door." The water split. What emerged was not beast nor machine, though it bore aspects of both. Iron plating covered its elongated form, fused into scaled segments. Pale tendrils of light pulsed beneath the metal like veins. Its head rose from the marsh on a serpentine neck, featureless save for a vertical seam that glowed from within. Torrin swore under his breath. "That's not possible," Lysa whispered. "The constructs were all destroyed." "Not all," Ira said. The thing turned toward her, not toward Torrin's sword. Not toward Cale's drawn bow, toward her. The seam along its head widened slightly. Light spilled from it, cold, colorless light, and the whisper returned, barer, her knees nearly buckled. Cale moved closer to her side. "Ira," she stepped forward. Torrin grabbed her arm. "Have you lost your mind?" "It won't attack," she said. "How do you know?" "I don't," she admitted. "But it's not here for us." The construct's body shifted, coiling along the water's surface without sinking. Its glowing seam flickered again. Images flooded her vision, not seen with eyes, but impressed upon her thoughts. A city of white towers, fire raining from a black sky. A circle of robed figures standing atop a cliff as the sea roared below. A door carved into stone, and herself, though older, scar splitting across her skin like lightning. She gasped and staggered back. The construct lowered its head until it hovered inches from her face. She felt no heat from it, no breath, only the steady pulse of something ancient. "You were made by the Order," she said hoarsely. The seam flared brighter. "You guard the path. another flare. Torin and Lysa exchanged glances. Kale's voice was tight. Ira, step away. The construct's tail lashed once, not in aggression but like a signal. Then slowly it turned. It glided through the marsh toward the southern horizon and stopped, looking back. Waiting, they followed it. They had little choice. The marshland that had seemed impassable now parted as the construct moved ahead of them. Water withdrew from its path. Mud hardened beneath their boots. Torin muttered curses under his breath but kept pace. After an hour, the smell of salt reached them. By dusk, the marsh gave way to cliffside. The sea spread before them, vast, slate-colored, restless, and far in the distance, barely visible through mist, isles. Not one, but a chain of jagged silhouettes rising from the water like broken teeth. The construct halted at the cliff's edge. Below, carved into the rock face, half concealed by tide and shadow, was an enormous archway. A door. Ira's breath caught. It was the same door from the vision. Carved from black stone veined with pale crystal. Symbols spiraled across its surface, intricate and precise. Lysa stumbled forward. This isn't in any record. It wouldn't be, Kale said softly. The construct lowered itself along the cliff, metal body adhering to stone, as though gravity had less claim on it than will did. It settled before the door and went still. The seam along its head dimmed, dormant, guarding. Ira descended the narrow path carved into the cliffside, her companions closed behind. As they approached, the symbols along the door began to glow faintly. Her scar burned in answer. She stepped forward alone. "You are the last door," she whispered. Understanding dawned not from the whisper, but from within. The Order had not built a door that required a key. They had built a door that required a living seal, someone marked, someone bound. Someone who could choose. Her hand trembled as she raised it toward the stone. Kale caught her wrist. "If this is what I think it is," he said quietly, "once it opens, there's no going back." She met his gaze. "Then don't follow." A muscle in his jaw ticked. He didn't let go. Instead, he placed his hand over hers and pressed it against the door. Light exploded outward, not destructive, revealing. The symbols flared brilliant white. The cliff trembled. The sea below roared as if in answer. Torin pulled Lysa back as cracks of light traced the arch's outline. Ira felt something tear, not flesh, not bone, but something deeper, a boundary. The door split down the center, slowly, stone grinding against stone. A gap widened, spilling radiance into the darkening air. Beyond it, not a chamber, not stone, but sky. An endless expanse of starlit sky, though night had not yet fallen. And within that sky, a floating city of pale towers and suspended bridges, intact and luminous, untouched by ash or ruin. Lysa's voice broke. "It survived." "No," Ira whispered. "It was hidden." The whisper returned one final time, clear and resonant. Choose, she understood now. The city beyond the door was not simply refuge. It was power, the last remnant of the Order's knowledge, their weapons, their constructs, their truths. And if she stepped through, the war would change, but so would she. The sea wind howled behind them. Torin's hand went to his sword. Kale's remained over hers. The floating city waited in impossible silence. Ira took one step forward, and the light swallowed her whole. When Ira opened her eyes, the world had changed entirely. The sky above was no longer the muted gray of the mainland, but a deep violet, dotted with stars so bright they seemed almost close enough to touch. The air hummed with energy, a low vibration that filled her chest and resonated along her scar, making her wince and gasp simultaneously. The floating city before her was unlike anything she had imagined in the whispered legends of the Order. Pale towers rose like shards of crystal, connected by delicate bridges that spanned between them. Water flowed in suspended streams that defied gravity, glimmering in soft arcs that caught the starlight. She blinked, trying to take it all in. Torin and Kale stood behind her, their faces pale but resolute, while Lysa knelt on the ground, scribbling hurried notes onto scraps of parchment that now seemed almost obsolete in the presence of what they saw. "It's alive," Lysa whispered, her voice trembling. "Everything here, it's not abandoned, it's functional." Ira didn't answer. Her attention was on the scar. The branching lines had expanded, glowing faintly as though syncing with the city itself. The realization hit her. The door hadn't just transported them physically. It had somehow attuned her to the city, to its rhythm, its presence. She felt a pull, a beckoning, almost like a heartbeat, guiding her forward. "Step carefully," Kale said, his hand brushing her shoulder. "We don't know what this place wants or if it considers us intruders." She nodded, but her curiosity was stronger than caution. With measured steps, she walked toward the nearest tower. Each footfall made no sound, yet she felt vibrations ripple beneath her, as though the stone beneath her responded to her movement. She reached the base of the tower, where a smooth surface glimmered with pale, shifting symbols. Ira extended a hand instinctively, and the symbols rearranged themselves beneath her fingers, forming a path upward, an invitation or a test, she couldn't tell. Torin was next, hesitant. He gripped his sword tighter as the path formed beneath him. Kale followed without hesitation, his eyes scanning the environment for any threat. Lysa lingered, her fascination rooted in the incredible mechanics of the city, trying to comprehend the laws of physics here. As they ascended the tower, the city revealed more of itself. Bridges stretched into impossible angles, floating platforms rotated slowly in the air, and distant spires emitted soft tones, almost musical, resonating in harmony with each other. Ira realized this was not just architecture, it was a network, a living system. Somehow it was alive, sentient in a way that defied her understanding, and she was aware of every pulse, every flicker, like a nerve connecting her to the city itself. Then came the first test. A bridge appeared ahead, spanning across an empty void, suspended by nothing visible. As they stepped onto it, the surface shifted subtly, responding to weight. Ira felt a sense of danger, but also of timing. She understood instinctively, move too quickly and it might vanish, hesitate and it might solidify beneath them permanently, trapping them mid-air. Step by step they crossed. The bridge responded to her presence, stretching and curving around them, guiding them toward the main spire. When the last foot left the bridge, the void below them yawned like a sleeping mouth, swallowing the path they had just crossed. Torin exhaled sharply, his face pale. Lysa shook her head in disbelief, and Kale gave a tight laugh, half in awe, half in fear. Why would the Order hide this? Torin asked. Why leave something so alive, so powerful? Ira didn't answer. She felt the city's pull again, stronger now, tugging at her toward the main spire. Inside, she sensed the knowledge of the Order, everything that had been lost during the Ashen War, their constructs, their archives, the designs of weapons and machines. Even secrets about the world itself. As they entered the main spire, the energy intensified. Holographic-like images shimmered into existence around them, depicting maps of distant lands, strange devices, and the construction of constructs they had never seen before. Lysa's eyes widened, and she began muttering calculations under her breath. Kale's jaw was tight, his usual calm shaken. Torin stood rigid, his hand still on his sword, wary of traps, ambushes, or worse, sentient defenses. Ira approached the central chamber. At its heart was a pedestal, carved from black stone veined with crystal. On it lay a small device that pulsed in rhythm with her scar. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the room seemed to respond. Light spread along the walls, activating a projection of a figure. It was humanoid, shrouded in a white robe, face obscured. A voice clear and resonant echoed in her mind rather than her ears. You are the bearer, the last door. You carry the choice of continuation or ending. She stepped back instinctively, but the projection remained calm, unmoving. The room vibrated lightly, like a breath held for centuries. Choice of continuation or ending, Kale whispered, echoing her thoughts aloud. What does it mean? The projection lifted a hand, and a globe formed in its palm, a miniature simulation of the world. Tiny dots of light shifted and moved, some dimming, some brightening, some disappearing entirely. The knowledge here, the voice said, can restore or destroy. It can undo the mistakes of the Ashen War or repeat them. You may guide it or you may lock it away forever. Ira swallowed hard, her mind raced, the scar burned. She felt both weight and responsibility pressing against her chest. If she chose incorrectly, if she failed to understand the city's language, the world outside could suffer. If she refused, the city might collapse, taking its secrets with it, and perhaps leaving the remnants of the Order's enemies free to hunt the knowledge elsewhere. She looked at Torin, Kale, and Lysa. Each of them had sacrificed to reach this point. Each had survived impossible trials, trusting her instincts and leadership. Now, everything rested on her on the last door. Her fingers hovered over the globe, the city hummed, its light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. The voice in her mind spoke again, decide, bearer. Decide now, for hesitation is choice, and choice has consequence. Ira exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. She could feel the weight of history, the ghosts of the Order, and the potential futures all pressing down on her. And then, she realized, the decision was not just about preservation or destruction. It was about trust in herself, in those who followed her, and in the path the Order had left for her to interpret. As her hand finally made contact with the globe, the projections shifted, spinning faster, collapsing in on themselves, rearranging into new patterns. Like a puzzle that demanded both logic and instinct. The chamber pulsed with light, and the city around them responded in kind. The bridges, towers, and flowing water aligned as if breathing in sync with her choice. Kale stepped closer, placing his hand lightly on her shoulder. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we face it together." Ira nodded. Her mind cleared just enough to make the choice she felt she had to make, and as the light enveloped her, she understood fully. The city was not just alive, it was testing them, testing her. Not for punishment, but for worthiness. And in that moment, she realized that survival, knowledge, and power were never simply about escaping the Ashen Guard or the shadows of the Order. They were about understanding the pulse of something far older than them, something that demanded patience, intelligence, and courage beyond fear. Outside, the wind howled, carrying whispers from the mainland. The cliffs, the sea, the marshes, they waited. But inside the city, light and sound converged, and Ira made her choice. What emerged next would determine not just their fate, but the legacy of the Order itself. And beyond that, what the Ashen Guard would find, or fail to find, would change the understanding of the world forever. The moment Ira's fingers pressed fully against the globe, a shock of light and sound reverberated through the city. It was not loud in the conventional sense. There was no roar, no clanging, but in her mind, every thought, every pulse of consciousness seemed to stretch and vibrate. The floating city responded as though recognizing her not just as a visitor, but as a bearer, the one chosen to activate its purpose. The bridges beneath them shifted slightly, rotating and aligning, forming patterns that defied normal geometry, creating paths that seemed to twist space itself. Torrens' breath caught as he glanced around. "It's moving the city, it's reacting to her." "Yes," Ira said, though her voice was a whisper, almost drowned by the internal hum that pulsed along her nerves. "It's alive and it's testing us." The globe she touched projected light into the room, filling the chamber with spirals of symbols, rotating in midair like a constellation of intelligence. The stars themselves seemed to shift, mirroring the patterns of the floating city beyond. Each symbol contained information, hidden, layered, and multifaceted, and yet somehow she could feel its meaning, not with her mind, but with her intuition, her very being. The Order's knowledge, Lysa breathed, stepping closer. It's not just history, it's predictive, strategic, almost alive. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the pulsating light. It's a map of everything, their constructs, their cities, even the movements of the Guard, and potentially the future. Ira's scar pulsed violently, pain and awareness intertwined. She knew suddenly that every choice she could make here would ripple outward, far beyond the city. One misstep could reveal their presence to the Ashen Guard, could destabilize the balance of power that the Order had preserved for centuries, or could erase this sanctuary entirely. Kale stepped forward. Touching it like this. What if we're not ready? What if it kills us?" Ira shook her head, a flicker of determination crossing her face. "No. It doesn't kill, not if you listen, not if you understand. It demands comprehension." The globe shifted beneath her touch, and suddenly the projections restructured themselves. Paths appeared, outlining parts of the city they hadn't seen before, hidden spires, subterranean chambers, and strange corridors that twisted in impossible angles. Among these, one path glowed brighter than the others, pulsing with a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. It beckoned her. "This is the core," she murmured. "Whatever the city wants us to find, it's there." Torren frowned, his hand still on the hilt of his sword. "Core? What kind of core? A weapon?" Ira's eyes met his. "Not a weapon, knowledge. The heart of the Order's intelligence, everything they left behind, the last archives." The concept hit them all at once. This wasn't just a city, it was a repository, a living network of the Order's genius, their failures, their victories, all encoded into the city itself. If they reached it, they could access centuries of information, secrets of the constructs, strategies, even lost technologies. But if the Ashen Guard found it first, or if they misused it, the consequences could be catastrophic. The path to the core was unlike anything they had traversed so far. Platforms rotated in midair, requiring precise timing. Bridges split into multiple paths, some leading to dead ends, others into darkness where the air seemed to hum with a weight of hidden threats. Ira led, guided by the pulsing light in the globe and the synchronicity she now felt with the city. Halfway to the core, a tremor shook the city. It was subtle at first, then grew, like the pulse of a distant heartbeat gaining strength. The floating towers swayed slightly, bridges quivered. Streams of water suspended in the air rippled and fell into the void below. "What now?" Torin shouted over the hum. Ira's hand pressed against the nearest bridge's surface, which shifted instantly under her touch, stabilizing. "The city is alive," she said firmly. "It feels fear or caution. It senses us as more than guests, but it doesn't yet trust us completely." Lysa's fingers flew over her notes, trying to keep up with everything. "The architecture itself is adaptive. The Order designed it to test intelligence, intuition, cooperation. Every misstep triggers a response. If we fail, it could isolate or trap us indefinitely." Kale's eyes scanned the expanse. "So every bridge, every pathway, every floating platform could be a trap," Ira nodded. "Or a guide. That's why I feel it responding to me, to us. We have to move as one, think as one, trust instinct over fear." They advanced slowly, cautiously. Each step was calculated, each turn was deliberate. And then, as they approached the main spire's upper chamber, the city itself seemed to converge. Towers rotated to align perfectly overhead, forming a roof of crystalline light. Water flows joined into spiraling columns that lifted skyward, creating a vortex around the spire. The globe pulsed with rapid intensity, projecting a map of the core itself, an intricate labyrinth of corridors, chambers, and what appeared to be control nodes scattered throughout. Ira's breath caught. The city was not merely a static archive, it was dynamic, interactive. It would respond to their actions, learning from their choices, testing their ability to navigate, think, and adapt. And somehow, she knew it could defend itself if necessary. The first real test came immediately. As they reached the base of the spire, a series of projections appeared, a simulation of the Ashen Guard, their forces sweeping across terrain similar to the floating city. The images were animated, showing potential strategies, threats, and outcomes. "They're showing us a scenario," Kale said, tension in his voice. "They're predicting what might happen if we try to take the core." "Exactly," Ira replied, "and the key isn't brute force, it's understanding, anticipating. We have to prove we belong." With the globe in her hand, Ira moved forward, tracing patterns along its surface. The projections shifted as she anticipated movements, adjusted positions, and highlighted paths. Each correct adjustment caused bridges to stabilize, corridors to open, and hidden elevators to rise from the void. Each error caused subtle tremors, brief flashes of collapsing pathways, but none fatal. Hours or perhaps moments passed in this state of suspended tension. Time had lost meaning. The city seemed endless, yet each step brought them closer to the heart of the Order's knowledge. Finally, they reached a chamber at the core, a massive, circular space filled with floating data spheres, pulsing with energy, each containing the collected intelligence of the Order. As Ira approached, the spheres aligned around her, forming a protective circle. The scar on her chest flared brightly, connecting her to every sphere simultaneously. "This is it," she whispered. The entire Order distilled into this city, waiting for the bearer to decide its fate. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all. One wrong choice could unravel everything. And just beyond that pressure, a faint hum began to echo from the walls, subtle but insistent, like a heartbeat not quite human, not quite machine. It was then that Ira understood fully. Reaching the core was only the beginning. Using it, understanding it, surviving it would be the true test. And somewhere far below in the marshes and cliffs, the Ashen Guard would already be sensing the shift, a ripple traveling through space and consciousness, announcing that the last door had opened. Because the city does not wait for permission, and the moment knowledge calls, the world begins to respond. The core of the city was not merely a chamber, it was a realm unto itself. Ira stepped into the center, the pulse of the data spheres resonating with her heartbeat, intertwining with her scar as though the two shared the same rhythm. The spheres rotated slowly around her, each one a translucent globe filled with moving patterns of light and shadow. Within those patterns, she could see the history of the Order, encoded in a language of symbols and sequences, some of which seemed alive, shifting as she looked at them. Torin, Kale, and Lysa lingered at the edges of the chamber, awe and tension etched across their faces. No words were spoken, none were necessary. The space was suffused with a weight that pressed on their minds and bodies, a kind of sentient expectation. Ira reached out with one hand and touched a sphere. The moment her fingers grazed its surface, the globe expanded, wrapping around her in light, and images flooded her mind. She saw the construction of the floating city, the battles the Order had fought, and the painstaking work of generations preserving knowledge while hiding it from enemies, both human and other. Every choice, every failure, every triumph of the Order was encoded here, as if the city itself were a living memory. Lysa gasped, stepping closer. It's interactive. It responds to thought, intention, even touch. This isn't just a library, it's a sentient archive. Yes, Ira said quietly, overwhelmed. It learns, it adapts. And it will only reveal itself fully to those it deems worthy. Her voice trembled, but there was determination there too. She could feel the weight of responsibility, heavier than any sword she had ever carried. We're not just visitors here, we're participants. The Order left this for someone like me, someone like us, but it demands more than courage. It demands comprehension. The first challenge came almost immediately. As Ira explored the spheres, a series of projections appeared in the chamber, surrounding the group. The projections were not physical enemies, but simulations, replicas of the Ashen Guard moving strategically through terrain, anticipating every possible decision the Order's bearers might make. The city's core was testing them, presenting hypothetical threats and scenarios to measure their insight, decision-making, and ability to act under pressure. Kale took a step back. Simulations. Are they trying to trick us? Ira shook her head. Not trick, test. They want to know if we can understand strategy, coordination, and foresight. If we fail, we might not be allowed to access the deeper knowledge. Torin frowned, but he didn't move. Then we do it, whatever it takes. We've come this far. Ira focused. The spheres responded to her intent. Paths opened, revealing nodes of information that she could connect, manipulating light and data in a way that felt almost magical. Each correct choice stabilized the simulations. Each misstep caused flashes of collapse in the projections, brief but unsettling. She realized that the core wasn't simply showing them the Order's history. It was teaching them to think like the Order, to anticipate, adapt, and control the flow of events. Hours, or perhaps mere minutes, passed in this state of intense mental exertion. Time felt suspended. The chamber seemed to pulse with a life of its own, guiding her, testing her, and responding to her every thought. Her companions watched, silent but attentive, ready to support if needed, though even their understanding of the city's mechanisms was limited. Then came the first warning. One of the spheres flickered, a deep crimson light spreading across its surface. The holographic simulation it projected showed a city under siege, not the floating city, but a reconstruction of one of the Order's ancient settlements. Shadows moved through the streets, and figures bearing the insignia of the Ashen Guard emerged. The scenario accelerated unnaturally, showing destruction, betrayal, and failure. "This is different," Lysa murmured, her voice tight. "It's real, or it's predicting something real." Ira's scar flared, a burning sensation that radiated through her chest. She instinctively raised a hand to the sphere, feeling the pulse of the city synchronize with hers. "It's a warning. We're being shown the consequences of failure." Kale's jaw tightened. "So it's not just a test of knowledge, it's a test of morality, strategy, maybe even survival." "Yes," Ira whispered. She focused, guiding the light within the sphere, rearranging the sequences to anticipate and counter the threats depicted. The crimson faded to gold, indicating stability. The other spheres adjusted, forming new patterns of data. Each victory unlocked further access, deeper into the city's core. And then the city revealed something unexpected, a sphere that did not rotate, that did not pulse like the others. Its surface was opaque, black, absorbing the light around it. When Ira reached out, her fingers did not touch it, yet she felt it, a heavy weight pressing against her mind, an intelligence ancient, patient, and aware of her presence. "It's different," Ira said, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the chamber. "It's not just knowledge, it's something else, something conscious." Torin and Kale exchanged glances. "Are you sure we should touch it?" Kale asked cautiously. Ira hesitated, then realized that hesitation itself might be unacceptable. The city had chosen her, and now it was demanding the next step. She placed her hand near the black sphere, feeling its gravity in her mind. It pulsed once, then began to open, revealing visions, memories, warnings, and possibilities spanning centuries. She saw the rise and fall of civilizations, battles fought in secret, alliances formed and broken, and the shadow of the Ashen Guard always looming, patient and unrelenting. This is the true knowledge of the Order, Ira whispered. Not just technology or strategy, but the history, the lessons, the warnings, everything they ever learned about power, control, and survival. The chamber shuddered. The light from the spheres intensified, filling the space with a brilliance that made it impossible to distinguish walls, floor, or ceiling. And in that brilliance, Ira felt it, an understanding, a connection, a responsibility far greater than anything she had ever imagined. The city was alive, yes, but it was also a guardian, a test, and now a guide. She turned to her companions. Torin's face was pale, his eyes wide with awe and fear. Kale's expression was tight, as if he were bracing for something inevitable. Lysa, despite her fascination, looked as if she were holding herself together with sheer willpower. Ira's voice was steady. We've reached the core, but reaching it is only the beginning. The city is showing us what it knows, but we have to decide how to use it. Every choice we make here will echo beyond these walls. And the Ashen Guard, they are already aware that something has shifted. Kale's hand went to the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the chamber. So we're not safe. Not even here, no, Ira agreed. But now we have the advantage, we have the knowledge. And if we act wisely, we might control the outcome instead of being swept away by it. The spheres pulsed in agreement, and the black sphere's intelligence reached out, touching Ira's mind directly. She understood fully that the next step would not be simple. It would demand not just courage and intellect, but intuition, trust, and a willingness to face truths too dangerous to ignore. And somewhere far away, beyond the cliffs, the marshes, and the sea, the Ashen Guard was moving. They would soon converge on the city, unaware of the true nature of what they sought, and unaware that the last door had already been opened. The city seemed to breathe around them, alive in a way that made the very air hum and shimmer. The floating towers, the arcs of water, the spiraling bridges, all responded to Ira's presence as though the core itself recognized her as more than a visitor. Every pulse of her scar resonated with the city's energy, linking her mind to the knowledge contained within the spheres. It was intoxicating and terrifying. She could feel centuries of the Order's wisdom, but also centuries of warning, caution, and failure. Torin and Kale followed her, their footsteps careful on the shifting surfaces, while Lysa moved like a ghost, scribbling frantic notes and sketches. It's beyond any architecture we've ever studied, Lysa murmured. These designs, they defy physics, logic, every principle we know. It's as if the city itself thinks, anticipates, and adapts. Ira nodded, her eyes fixed on the black sphere at the chamber's center. She had touched it, but now she realized that to truly access its knowledge, she needed more than touch. She needed to understand its purpose, to interact with it in a way that went beyond instinct. The city had tested them up to this point, but the next stage was different. It was personal, intimate. It demanded choice, morality, and judgment. The black sphere pulsed slowly, and within it she began to see visions, not just of the Order, but of the Ashen Guard, and of what might come if its knowledge were misused. The simulations were vivid, cities burning under a red sky, armies crushed by constructs of the Order's design, innocents caught in the crossfire. And then in stark contrast she saw hope, places rebuilt, alliances forged, peace maintained through understanding and careful guidance. This isn't just knowledge, Ira whispered, the weight of realization settling over her. It's a responsibility. Whoever controls this, whoever understands it, shapes the world. Torin's voice broke through her reverie. And if we fail, he asked quietly. If we make the wrong choice, Ira shook her head. Then the Order's mistakes repeat. History's lessons are lost, and the Ashen Guard, they would take what remains and twist it for their purposes. We cannot fail, Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Then we don't. We understand it, we use it wisely, and we keep it from falling into the wrong hands. The city reacted to her resolve. Light flared along the bridges, the towers rotated, and streams of water shifted to form a path leading deeper into the spire. The sphere's surface rippled, revealing a corridor of floating platforms, each one glowing faintly with symbols that matched those on her scar. The path was clear, and yet she felt the tension behind it. Every step would be a test, every choice scrutinized by the city itself. As they moved forward, the first true challenge presented itself. A series of platforms hovered over an empty void, each one shifting unpredictably. Some tilted, some rotated, and others disappeared entirely, reappearing moments later in a different position. The air hummed, vibrating against their chests and ears. Ira felt the pulse of the city synchronize with her heartbeat. The bridge was alive, testing their timing, focus, and coordination. Careful, she murmured, we moved together in rhythm. Step by step they advanced. Torin led after her, watching for sudden shifts, while Kale and Lysa followed closely. One false move would plunge them into the void below, or trigger some unseen defense mechanism. The tension was suffocating, each platform a moment suspended between success and disaster. Midway across, the city shifted again. The platforms began to ascend, forming a spiraling staircase leading upward. The light from the core pulsed brighter, almost guiding them, but also warning them. Ira understood the city was offering guidance, but only to those it trusted. Misinterpretation could mean catastrophe. When they reached the top, the chamber opened into a massive hall, larger than any structure they had encountered. The walls were lined with floating spheres, each projecting visions of the Order's greatest achievements and darkest mistakes. Constructs moved silently among the spheres, performing tasks without human direction, their movements precise and purposeful. And at the center, the black sphere pulsed more intensely, beckoning Ira forward. She stepped closer, feeling the weight of every choice she had ever made. The sphere responded to her presence, projecting memories, not just of the Order, but of her own journey, the decisions, the sacrifices, the fear, and the courage that had brought them to this point. It was as if the city was measuring not just knowledge, but character. Ira, Kale said softly, this is it. Whatever happens next, we face it together. She nodded, raising her hand once more. The black sphere expanded, enveloping her in a cocoon of light. Visions surged through her mind, strategies, constructs, hidden archives, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the Ashen Guard closing in. Every possibility, every outcome, every consequence was laid bare. The weight was unbearable, but clarity began to form. She saw the path forward, how to use the city's knowledge to protect it, to guide those who would follow, and to prevent the Ashen Guard from gaining control. But she also saw the cost. Every decision would demand sacrifice, and some truths were too dangerous to share. The city was not a tool, it was a responsibility, a living legacy of the Order that required wisdom, restraint, and courage beyond measure. As the visions receded, Ira felt herself grounded once more. The city pulsed around her, acknowledging her understanding. The black sphere's light dimmed slightly, settling into a steady glow. She turned to her companions, seeing their faces filled with awe, fear, and determination. We have it, she said quietly. We understand it, but understanding is only the beginning. We now have to act, and every action from this point forward will matter. The floating city seemed to hum in agreement, the bridges and towers shifting subtly, aligning as if preparing for what was to come. Outside, far across the sea, the Ashen Guard was already moving, unaware of the full scale of what they were approaching. Ira took a deep breath. The next steps would test not just their intellect, but their resolve, their morality, and their very survival. The knowledge of the Order was now theirs, but the city had made it clear. To wield it, they had to prove themselves worthy in every sense. And somewhere beyond the light in the floating towers, a shadow stirred, anticipating the choices of the last door's bearer, and preparing to challenge them in ways that would push every limit they had ever known. The floating city trembled subtly, as if aware of a new presence approaching from beyond its boundaries. Ira felt it before she heard it, the faint vibration that pulsed not through the floor, but through the very air, like distant footsteps echoing in the mind rather than the ears. The Ashen Guard was moving, converging on the location of the last door with relentless precision. They were unaware of the city's true nature, blind to the intelligence it possessed, but their instincts were sharp, honed over centuries of hunting, of seeking out the Order's secrets. Torin's hand tightened on his sword. I can feel them, he murmured. They're close, too close. Kale scanned the horizon, though there was nothing visible from the heights of the spire. They don't see us, he said, but the city does. And whatever it does next, it won't be subtle. Ira's scar throbbed with renewed intensity, the pulse of the city sinking with the distant approach of the guard. She realized with a rising tension that the city was preparing, its defenses awakening in response to an imminent threat. She turned to her companions. Stay close, follow my light. The city will guide us, but it also tests us. One mistake and it could be deadly. As they descended from the core chamber, the city began to shift with an almost predatory awareness. Bridges rotated, creating corridors that were navigable only in precise sequence. Platforms moved to isolate them from the edges of voids below. Water streams condensed into walls, forming barriers and channels that controlled the path forward. Every step, every breath was measured, as if the city itself were orchestrating their journey. Then the first true defense appeared. A corridor of light opened before them, and from it emerged projections, not just holographic images, but constructs with substance, able to interact with the physical world. They were faint, semi-transparent, yet their presence carried weight. They moved with precision, analyzing the group, forcing them to adapt. Torin raised his sword instinctively, but Ira stopped him. "Don't attack blindly," she whispered. "These are tests. We need to prove worthiness, not strength." The constructs halted, and as Ira approached the nearest one, the light shimmered, revealing symbols that mirrored those on her scar. She instinctively traced patterns in the air, and the construct paused, then stepped aside. One by one, she repeated the process, guiding Torin, Kale, and Lysa through the corridor. Each successful interaction caused the corridor to open further, revealing a larger hall where the city's intelligence seemed to coalesce. There, a massive projection of the Ashen Guard appeared, advancing toward the city. The holographic simulation displayed their strategy, showing soldiers deploying in coordinated formations, spreading across terrain that mimicked the floating city itself. Ira realized immediately that this was more than a test. It was a rehearsal, a warning of what was coming. "They're showing us what's likely to happen," Lysa whispered, her hands trembling as she scribbled notes. "It's predictive. They're anticipating our moves, our decisions." "Yes," Ira said. "And we need to anticipate theirs. We cannot fight them directly. We have to outthink them." The city responded to her realization. Towers shifted, creating choke points. Bridges formed shortcuts and alternative paths, some visible, others only emerging in response to precise steps. Suspended platforms rotated to isolate threats and guide the group safely. The city was alive, yes, but now it was an ally, a partner in strategy, but only if they could understand its language. As they advanced deeper into the hall, a sudden tremor shook the spire. The floor quivered beneath their feet, and a section of the corridor collapsed into the void below. Torin caught Ira by the arm. "The guard isn't here yet, and it's already reacting." Ira's eyes narrowed. "The city is warning us. The moment they arrive, the stakes will be higher. We must move carefully, deliberately, and together." They pressed on, navigating through shifting corridors, rotating platforms, and streams of water that formed barriers and bridges simultaneously. The city's defenses were intricate, adaptive, and terrifying in their complexity. And through it all, the black sphere pulsed from the core, guiding them, its intelligence a constant, subtle presence in Ira's mind. Finally, they reached an observation point high above the city. From there, they could see distant shadows moving across the water, approaching with steady determination. The Ashen Guard was advancing faster than Ira had anticipated. Small boats cut through the fog, carrying soldiers armed with weapons that gleamed in the pale light. They had no idea what awaited them, but instinct told Ira that they would not underestimate the floating city for long. Kale clenched his fists. "They're going to hit us hard." "Yes," Ira said quietly, "but we have the advantage. The city is alive, it knows us. And if we follow its guidance, we can turn the approach of the guard into something manageable." She turned back to the black sphere. Its pulse accelerated as if sensing the proximity of the intruders. Visions flashed in her mind, simulations of defensive formations, potential ambush points, and strategies that would allow them to survive the initial engagement. She realized the city was teaching them not just to react, but to command. Torin swallowed hard. "So, we fight with it, not against it," Ira nodded. "Exactly, we become part of it. We anticipate, we adapt, and we guide it. The guard doesn't know what they're about to face. But the city, it does." As the shadows of the Ashen Guard grew larger, cutting through the mist over the cliffs and water, Ira felt a mix of fear, exhilaration, and resolve. The knowledge of the Order was now a weapon, a tool, and a responsibility. Every decision they made in the coming moments would determine not just their survival, but the fate of the city, the legacy of the Order, and the balance of power in the world beyond. And then the first strike came, not with weapons, but with intelligence. Drones, sent by the Ashen Guard, hovered over the water, scanning for anomalies. The city reacted instantly. Bridges shifted, light barriers rose, and hidden platforms moved into position. The game had begun, and Ira knew that this was only the opening move. The first clash was nothing like Ira had imagined. There was no thunder of cannon fire, no overwhelming roar of soldiers, at least not at first. The Ashen Guard approached with calculated precision, their drones and scouts skimming just above the water, probing for weaknesses, analyzing the floating city with cold efficiency. From their perspective, the city was an anomaly, a marvel of impossible architecture, but it was also a target, and targets demanded conquest. Ira felt the pulse of the black sphere intensify, and she instinctively reached out, connecting her mind to the city's intelligence. The platforms beneath them shifted subtly, guiding her group to vantage points where they could observe the guard without being seen. Bridges rotated silently, forming barriers and choke points that channeled the approaching forces into predictable paths. The floating city was no longer just a repository of knowledge, it was a living defense system, and now it was awake. Torin whispered, his voice tense, "It's anticipating them. The city knows where they'll strike before they do." "Yes," Ira replied, feeling the energy of the core resonate through her scar, "and it's teaching us to anticipate too. Every move we make shapes the response. We're part of it now, part of the strategy." Lysa clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. "It's incredible, almost like it can see into the future. But how do we control it? How do we make sure it doesn't turn on us?" Ira considered that. The city was sentient, yes, but it also responded to intent. If they acted with clarity, precision, and purpose, it would protect them. Hesitation, fear, or selfishness could trigger defensive measures that might trap or even harm them. "We act together," she said firmly. "Every thought, every decision has to be deliberate. We guide the city, but we also trust it." The first wave of the Ashen Guard arrived in boats, cutting through the mist, their formations tight and deliberate. Soldiers scanned with their instruments, unaware of the shifting platforms and protective walls that rose around them. Ira moved methodically, gesturing to the city, directing its intelligence through the black sphere. Bridges rotated to funnel the soldiers into sections already mapped in the core simulations. Suspended water walls created barriers that slowed the advance, forcing the guard into predictable patterns. Kale's eyes narrowed. "They're good, but they're walking right into traps they don't even know exist." Ira's pulse quickened. The city had anticipated their presence, yes, but the guard was adaptable, capable of analyzing and responding. If they weren't careful, the advantage could slip away. She focused on the black sphere, feeling the information flow, routes, strategies, potential countermeasures. Every choice had to balance control with subtlety. Too aggressive and the city might harm allies, too passive and the guard would exploit gaps. The first contact was subtle. A drone hovering too close was drawn into a sudden vortex of light, lifted from the water, and carried harmlessly into the sky before being expelled far beyond their reach. The soldiers shouted, confused, but they pressed forward. The city responded, redirecting the waves, raising barriers of energy that shimmered like crystalline glass, and guiding Ira's team to higher vantage points. Torin looked down, his sword still at his side, tension written on his face. "It's beautiful but terrifying. One wrong move and the city could kill them, or us." Ira's voice was calm, though her mind raced. "It won't harm innocents if we act correctly. But the guard is a threat, and the city protects what it recognizes as vital. We have to keep them contained, guided, without tipping them off that we're aware of everything." The second wave was more organized. Soldiers had begun to split, moving along alternative paths in an attempt to flank the floating city. Ira sensed the tension rising in the city itself. The pulse of the black sphere quickened. It was testing their judgment now. How would they respond to unexpected variables, to challenges not accounted for in prior simulations? "Look," Lysa shouted, pointing to a projection forming near the spire. A map of the city, overlaid with the guards' positions, appeared as a hologram, highlighting potential vulnerabilities. The city was offering insight, but only to those who could interpret it quickly. Ira stepped forward, placing her hand on the black sphere. Visions flowed through her mind, corridors that could close off, platforms that could rise, water walls that could redirect forces. She began to manipulate them with careful gestures, guiding the city to create a series of controlled traps. Soldiers were funneled into loops, pushed back by sudden elevation changes and shifting bridges. Every time the guard adapted, the city adjusted, responding instantly to their tactics. Kale's jaw tightened as he watched. They don't know what hit them. This isn't a fight, it's a lesson in futility. Torin glanced at Ira, and we're the teachers in a sense, but it's dangerous. We're directing an entire battlefield. Ira nodded, her mind fully engaged. Yes, and that's exactly what the city wanted. We're learning to command, to anticipate, to decide, not just for ourselves, but for the protection of knowledge, for the Order's legacy. But as the battle continued, the city introduced a new challenge, a projection of civilians trapped in a corridor, their forms flickering between reality and simulation. The city's pulse quickened again, signaling a moral test. Ira realized immediately they were being challenged not just strategically, but ethically. Could they protect knowledge while ensuring the safety of innocence? Could they balance control with compassion? Her mind raced. If they focused only on defeating the guard, these lives could be endangered. But if they hesitated, the guard could exploit the gap. She reached out to the black sphere, tracing patterns that would simultaneously protect the civilians and redirect the guard into containment paths. The city responded instantly, light walls forming around the innocents, while bridges shifted to isolate the soldiers. Lysa's eyes were wide with awe. It's perfect coordination. But the city, it's asking us to make decisions that no one else could make. Yes, Ira said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline, and that's the burden of the bearer. Knowledge without judgment is dangerous. We must guide wisely, act carefully, and anticipate consequences. From above, the Ashen Guard could see their plans unraveling, their formations disrupted without understanding why. Frustration and confusion rippled through their ranks. The city's defenses, guided by Ira, were flawless, but it required her full attention, her complete alignment with the intelligence of the Black Sphere. Every decision was a test, every adjustment a measure of their worthiness. As the first moral and strategic trials concluded, the city's pulse began to slow, almost in approval. The guard had been contained, redirected, and confused, but not harmed beyond necessity. Ira exhaled slowly, aware that this was only the beginning. The floating city had revealed its power and its purpose, but it had also set the stage for even greater challenges. The air after the first engagement was electric, charged with the hum of the city and the tension of what had just transpired. Ira could still feel the pulse of the Black Sphere reverberating through her scar, as though the city itself were acknowledging the group's actions. They had passed the first test, guiding the Ashen Guard without unnecessary harm, but she knew this was only a prelude. The city's intelligence had shown them the power they now wielded, but it had also reminded them of the weight of responsibility that came with it. Torin leaned against a crystalline wall, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his composure. "I've never felt anything like that," he admitted, voice low. "It's like the city isn't just alive, it's watching, judging, and teaching, and it's terrifying." Ira nodded, her eyes scanning the shifting platforms and the towers above. "It's not just alive. It's intelligent, and it's expecting us to rise to its standards, to think and act as the Order would. That's what makes it so dangerous and so powerful." Lysa, still clutching her notebook, finally spoke, her voice trembling with awe. "It's more than strategy, it's moral. Every choice we made, the city didn't just respond to our tactics. It responded to our intent, our judgment. If we had acted recklessly," she swallowed hard, "it would have punished us." Kale, usually stoic, let out a long breath and shook his head. "We've been tested and survived, but they'll come back. The Ashen Guard won't retreat, they adapt. And now they know there's more to this city than they anticipated." Ira's mind was already racing ahead, anticipating the next moves, the next waves of conflict. The city had revealed both its potential and its demands, and in that revelation, she understood the first true burden of the Order's knowledge: power was never neutral. It carried consequences, and the weight of those consequences fell on the bearer's shoulders. From the vantage point of the observation platforms, Ira could see the distant approach of new forces. The Ashen Guard were regrouping, reorganizing their tactics, and now deploying heavier instruments, boats larger, armed with weapons and detection devices designed to bypass simple tricks. Their movements were methodical, but Ira sensed impatience beneath the calculated surface, a rising desperation. They had underestimated the floating city, and that error would force them into riskier maneuvers. The city responded instinctively, shifting bridges and raising barriers. Platforms moved to isolate new intrusions, while creating vantage points for her companions to oversee the battlefield. Ira realized the next phase would demand more than strategy. It would demand moral clarity. A projection from the black sphere appeared before her, showing civilians caught in potential crossfire between the guards' reinforcements and the city's defenses. Their faces flickered in and out, phantoms of consequence, each one a reminder that knowledge and power must be tempered with wisdom. "We have to protect them," Ira said, her voice quiet but firm. "The city's showing us what's at stake, not just our lives, not just the knowledge, but innocence. That's what the Order always fought for." Torin's eyes widened. "So every move we make now isn't just tactical, it's ethical. Every choice could save or endanger lives." "Yes," Ira said, placing a hand on the black sphere. She felt the pulse intensify, almost as if the city were responding to her decision to prioritize protection over aggression. "We must act deliberately. Every path we choose, every bridge we shift, every wall we raise, it must account for the consequences." The city responded with subtle shifts. Platforms rearranged themselves, creating protective corridors for civilians, while simultaneously diverting the Ashen Guard into loops that neutralized their advantage without direct confrontation. The intelligence of the city was vast, but it required guidance, and Ira now understood that guidance was inseparable from moral choice. Kale's jaw tightened as he watched the simulations. "It's beautiful and terrifying. The city doesn't just fight for us, it trusts us to make the right decisions." Ira exhaled slowly, feeling the enormity of that trust settle on her shoulders. The Order's knowledge was no longer an abstract concept. It was living, reactive, and dependent on their judgment. The floating city, once a place of archives and history, had become a partner, a battleground, and a teacher all at once. Outside, the Ashen Guard's movements grew more desperate, their forces spreading wider, attempting to bypass the city's manipulations. The drones hummed aggressively, and reconnaissance boats advanced along unpredictable paths. But Ira, connected to the black sphere, anticipated each move, guiding the city's energy to counter without directly harming. Bridges rotated, water barriers shifted, and light walls formed protective shells around vulnerable points. Lysa whispered in awe, "It's like the city itself is alive, but also moral. It knows right from wrong, or at least it responds to what we decide is right." Ira's mind raced with the implications. Exactly, and that's why the next phase is so critical. We are no longer just navigating the city, we are shaping its response, its judgment. In the Ashen Guard, they are unaware of how fully they are being controlled by our decisions. The distant sounds of approaching boats grew louder, sharper, the tension almost unbearable. Ira's pulse synced with the black sphere's rhythmic glow. She realized, with a mix of awe and dread, that the first engagement had been a test of coordination and strategy. But what was coming next would be a test of everything: intellect, morality, courage, and the ability to bear the weight of knowledge that could shape life and death. The floating city shifted subtly beneath their feet, a warning and a promise. The Ashen Guard would strike again, and this time the stakes were higher. Ira and her companions stood at the threshold of a confrontation that would define the future of the Order's legacy, the city itself, and the fragile balance between knowledge, power, and morality. And somewhere beyond the mist and the waves, the Ashen Guard's commanders adjusted their strategy, unaware that every choice they made was already anticipated, already accounted for, and that the floating city, alive and intelligent, was already shaping their fate. The fog over the water thickened as dawn approached, painting the horizon in muted shades of gray and gold. From their vantage atop the spire, Ira and her companions could see the Ashen Guard assembling in numbers greater than they had before. A dark fleet slicing through the mist with purpose and precision. The sound of oars cutting through water was accompanied by a low mechanical hum, drones and automated scouts scanning, probing, calculating. This was no longer a mere reconnaissance, it was the opening of a calculated assault. Ira's scar pulsed violently as she connected once more with the black sphere. The city had awoken fully now, its defenses no longer tentative, its intelligence sharpened by the prior engagement. She felt the patterns of the guard's movements as though they were currents in a river, flowing toward her, predictable only if she remained entirely in sync with the city's rhythm. Her mind raced, translating every pulse, every shimmer of light into strategy, into the subtle manipulations of the floating platforms, water walls, and bridges that responded instantly to her intentions. Torin's hand hovered over his sword, his jaw tight. "They've learned from before," he said, voice low. They're not coming at us the same way. Ira nodded without turning, her eyes locked on the first wave of boats cutting through the haze. Exactly, they've adapted, but so have we. The city isn't just reactive, it's proactive. It anticipates, calculates, and guides. We have to maintain focus. Every misstep now could be catastrophic. The first assault began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Drones hovered just above the mist, scanning for energy signatures, for shifts in light and shadow, for anything that might indicate life within the city. The platforms beneath Ira's feet tilted gently, guiding her companions into positions of observation and control, while water walls rose in arcs to obscure visibility from the drones. The city was alive, responding with elegance and precision, yet there was an underlying tension, a reminder that the Ashen Guard would not be deterred easily. Kale's voice broke the silence. We can't just defend, they'll push harder each time. Eventually it won't be enough. Ira's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. We're not just defending, she said quietly. We're teaching the city to respond, to adapt. The Order's legacy is not in hiding knowledge, it's in using it wisely. We guide the city, and it guides the world. But this is the first real trial of that guidance. The Ashen Guard's approach intensified. Boats began to spread, moving along multiple vectors simultaneously, while drones swooped in unpredictable arcs. Ira sensed the weight of the next moral and strategic choice pressing down on her. The city could strike decisively, neutralizing the intruders, but doing so risked harming innocents projected in simulations, representations of what the city deemed potentially vulnerable lives. Every defensive action now carried consequence, and hesitation could be as dangerous as recklessness. Torin moved closer, his voice steady but tense. Ira, they're splitting. One group goes left, another right. If we react to both, we'll be stretched thin. Are we ready for that? Yes, Ira whispered, feeling the pulse of the black sphere sync with her heartbeat. We have to trust the city and each other. Our decisions now define its intelligence. It will protect what we guide it to value. But we must act decisively. She extended her hands, and the platforms beneath her shifted in a coordinated dance, isolating channels, creating controlled zones where the guard could move without gaining advantage. Water walls formed to deflect surveillance, while bridges rotated to channel the boats into containment loops. Light walls flickered, forming corridors and barriers that protected civilians and allies without directly engaging the enemy. Lysa's voice quivered with awe. It's like watching the city fight and think at the same time, and you're inside it, directing it. Yes, Ira said, but the challenge is far from over. This isn't just about tactics. The city will test our judgment, our ethics, our understanding of consequences. Every move, every command must consider lives, strategy, and morality. The Order never intended for knowledge to be wielded without responsibility. The first collision occurred with subtle brilliance. Drones that moved too close to the city's energy fields were lifted, redirected, and expelled far from the floating spire. Boats that tried to flank were guided into containment loops, isolated by shifting platforms and rising walls of water. The guards' confusion was palpable, their confidence shaken, though they had no idea what force opposed them. Kale's jaw tightened. They have no clue how trapped they are. This isn't combat, it's theater, and we're the directors. Ira's pulse quickened as the black sphere expanded its light, projecting simulations directly into her mind. She saw the next potential assaults, each one requiring a delicate balance of action and restraint. Too aggressive, and they could inadvertently cause harm. Too passive, and the Ashen Guard would exploit openings. Every choice was a moral trial, every movement a test of their worthiness as bearers of the Order's legacy. Then came the first impossible decision. A projection of civilians flickered across multiple zones simultaneously, their positions intersecting with projected paths of the guards' advancing drones and boats. If the city executed a purely defensive response, some projections would be endangered. If Ira adjusted the city's response manually, she risked overextending her influence, leaving gaps the guard could exploit. She felt the weight of centuries of the Order's lessons pressing down on her. This was the crucible, the moment where knowledge and morality converged. One miscalculation could result in devastation. One hesitation could cost lives. Ira's voice was calm, though her mind was a storm of calculations and intuition. We act with purpose. We protect those we can, channel the rest, and anticipate consequences we cannot yet see. Trust the city and trust ourselves. The black sphere pulsed in agreement, and the floating city responded with subtle shifts that combined precision, foresight, and moral guidance. Platforms rotated to isolate the Ashen Guard, water walls redirected potential threats, and light barriers created safe zones for the projections. Every movement was measured, every reaction deliberate. Torin exhaled slowly, all written across his face. I've never seen anything like this. It's not just defense, it's judgment, strategy, ethics, all in one. Ira looked out across the mist, toward the advancing shadows of the guard. Their assault was relentless, but now, with the city alive beneath their feet, she understood the truth. Knowledge without responsibility was chaos. Power without judgment was destruction. And the black sphere, the heart of the city, was not just a tool. It was a mirror of their own moral and strategic capacities. As the Ashen Guard pressed closer, Ira's hands hovered over the energy of the black sphere. The city's pulse aligned with hers, a living rhythm of intelligence and anticipation. She realized fully that this was more than a battle. It was the first true test of what it meant to bear the Order's legacy, to wield knowledge responsibly, and to guide a living force with both courage and morality. And somewhere in the mist, the Ashen Guard prepared for the next strike. Unaware that the very city they sought to conquer was already using every ounce of its intelligence, and the bearer's judgment to outmaneuver, outthink, and contain them. The mist over the water thickened, swallowing the horizon and giving the approaching Ashen Guard an eerie, spectral quality. From the spire's dizzying heights, Ira could see the shapes of their boats slicing through the fog, their weapons glinting faintly in the pale morning light. The hum of drones grew louder, each one scanning, calculating, probing for weaknesses. The city beneath her feet responded immediately, subtly shifting platforms, raising protective walls of water, and guiding the team to positions where they could oversee the unfolding assault. But Ira knew this was only the beginning. The Ashen Guard would not retreat, they would escalate, push harder, and adapt. Torin's hand gripped the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white. "They're moving faster now," he said, voice low. "They've figured out we're not just hiding, they're testing the city itself." Ira's scar pulsed with the city's awareness. They've learned, yes. But we're not just defending, we're teaching the city to respond, to anticipate. Every maneuver, every pattern we create reshapes the battlefield. The Order didn't leave this knowledge to be wielded blindly. It's a test of judgment as much as strategy. The first significant escalation came in the form of a coordinated flanking maneuver. Two smaller flotillas split from the main force, aiming to strike from angles that had previously seemed secure. Ira felt the tension spike in the city's pulse. It was sending a clear signal. This was a test of coordination, perception, and moral choice. She realized immediately that their success would depend not only on strategy, but on ethical precision. "Look," Lysa whispered, pointing toward the projections that flickered in multiple corridors. Civilians appeared in simulated danger zones, their images superimposed over the paths the Ashen Guard's boats would take. The city is showing us the risk to innocence. We can't just focus on strategy, every action matters morally. Ira exhaled, steadying herself. Exactly, we cannot sacrifice the few for the sake of control. We must act decisively, but with conscience. The city will respond to intent as much as action. We have to guide it with both. The black sphere expanded, its light intensifying as it interfaced with Ira's mind. She saw the projected paths of the Ashen Guard, but the city revealed something deeper. Contingencies, potential reactions, even the subtle weaknesses in the Guard's coordination. It was a battlefield of probabilities, a complex puzzle where every decision carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Torin glanced at her, concern etched across his face. "So we have to think 2 steps ahead, no, 5 steps ahead, and also make sure we're doing the right thing morally." Ira nodded, yes. "And it's not just our lives on the line, it's the legacy of the Order, the safety of innocence, and the balance of knowledge and power. We cannot fail." With a subtle gesture, Ira guided the city's energy to isolate the flanking flotillas. Platforms rose to redirect their approach, water barriers diverted drones, and light walls formed protective corridors around simulated civilians. The Ashen Guard hesitated, their formations disrupted by forces they could not comprehend. Their confidence faltered, replaced by confusion and frustration, yet they pressed on, unaware that every movement had been anticipated. Kale's eyes narrowed. They're good, but they don't understand the battlefield. We're shaping it faster than they can react. Yes, Ira said, but the real challenge isn't controlling them, it's controlling ourselves, our judgment. The city reflects our choices. If we act selfishly, recklessly, or without care, it could turn against us or fail to protect what matters. The Ashen Guard's response grew more aggressive. Larger vessels moved toward the city's outer platforms, and drones swarmed like a metallic storm. But the floating city adapted instantly, shifting pathways, creating barriers, and guiding the companions to positions that allowed maximum oversight and minimal exposure. Ira realized the battle was no longer just physical, it was mental and ethical, a test of judgment as much as skill. Then came the first irreversible choice. A series of projections indicated civilians trapped at the edge of a platform that was about to collapse under the guard's pressure. If Ira redirected the city's defenses entirely to protect them, a gap would open elsewhere, allowing the guard to infiltrate a key chamber. If she prioritized the city's structural integrity, the civilians would be endangered. Every option carried moral weight and tactical risk. Ira's heart pounded as she made the decision. "We protect them," she said, voice firm. "We cannot sacrifice innocence for strategy. The city will adjust." "We must trust it." The platforms shifted, walls of water rose, and light barriers enveloped the civilians. The city compensated for the temporary gap, redirecting the Ashen Guard's forces into containment loops and isolating their advance. Torin and Kale executed the city's guidance flawlessly, moving to secure positions while Lysa documented the shifting corridors and defensive patterns. As the dust of the first real ethical trial settled, Ira felt the city's pulse slow slightly, almost in approval. She realized that this was a turning point, the first test where morality and strategy intersected in a way that would define her role as the bearer of the Order's knowledge. The Ashen Guard had been contained, but the psychological and ethical weight of the decisions made would linger, a constant reminder that power without conscience was meaningless. The distant horizon shimmered with movement. Reinforcements were approaching, larger and more heavily armed, their strategy more sophisticated, their intent clear. The Ashen Guard would not yield. The floating city responded subtly, preparing corridors, isolating zones, and testing the companions' readiness for the next trial. Ira's mind was focused, yet aware of the growing tension in her companions. "We've survived the first wave," she said quietly, "but the real test is coming. Every choice from this point forward will have irreversible consequences. We must remain vigilant, deliberate, and morally precise. The Order's legacy depends on it, and so does the city." The sun had barely risen, yet the fog had thickened into a suffocating shroud that wrapped the floating city in an eerie, muted silence. Ira's eyes scanned the horizon, but the Ashen Guard's numbers seemed endless, their boats and drones emerging like shadows through the mist, each one a harbinger of precision and cold intent. The first engagements had been a test. This was the true assault, a relentless push designed not only to break defenses, but to probe the limits of judgment, strategy, and morality. The black sphere pulsed rapidly in her mind, a rhythmic warning that the city sensed imminent danger on multiple fronts. Platforms shifted with uncanny coordination beneath her feet, forming barriers, guiding corridors, and protective zones around civilians. Water walls rose in arcs, light walls flickered into existence, and suspended bridges rotated to channel the Ashen Guard into predictable paths. But this time, their predictability was far from guaranteed. Torin's voice was tense, barely audible above the faint hum of the city's energy. "They've split into 3 waves, no, 4. They're coordinating now, trying to overwhelm us." Ira's gaze hardened. "Yes, and they've adapted. The city's pulse tells me they're anticipating our previous patterns. We must be faster, smarter, and more deliberate. Every move we make is under scrutiny from them, from the city, and from ourselves." Kale scanned the shifting corridors and rising platforms. "We can't just react anymore. We have to anticipate, predict, and control without hesitation. One misstep, one lapse in judgment, and it's over." Ira nodded, connecting deeply with the black sphere. The city's intelligence was vast, but it required conscious guidance. Every platform shift, every water barrier, every manipulation of light walls had to balance strategy with morality. The first irreversible trial had taught them that. Now, the test was relentless. The Ashen Guard struck from multiple angles simultaneously. Drones swooped low, scanning, recording, and preparing for strikes. Boats flanked, attempting to exploit any perceived weakness in the city's defenses. Ira's mind raced, translating the pulse of the city into precise commands. Platforms rotated to isolate threats, water walls diverted drones, and light barriers created protective corridors for civilians caught in the crossfire. Every defensive action was layered, simultaneous, and precise. Then came the moment that would define the first true moral crucible of the battle. A group of civilians, projected in multiple zones, was directly in the path of two of the Ashen Guard's fastest vessels. If Ira acted to protect them manually, she would have to redirect the city's defenses away from other sectors, leaving a gap through which the Guard could infiltrate a critical chamber, housing historical archives and knowledge of the Order. If she prioritized the city's structural integrity, the civilians would be endangered, and the moral weight of that choice would fall squarely on her shoulders. Ira's heart pounded, each beat syncing with the black sphere's intensified pulse. She closed her eyes, feeling the city's intelligence flow into her consciousness, guiding, warning, and challenging simultaneously. "We protect the civilians," she whispered almost to herself, "and trust the city to adapt." Instantly, platforms shifted beneath their feet, corridors rotated, and water walls rose to isolate the Ashen Guard's vessels. Light barriers enveloped the civilians in protective shells. The city compensated for the temporary vulnerability in other areas, redirecting the Guard's approach into containment loops, forcing them to stall without causing direct harm. Ira's companions moved in flawless coordination, executing the city's guidance with precision, while Lysa recorded the unfolding patterns, documenting the intelligence at work. Torin exhaled slowly, all written across his face. "It's like the city is alive and we're inside it, directing every heartbeat, but it's terrifying. One mistake," Ira nodded, still focused. "Yes. One mistake could undo everything, but hesitation is worse. The city trusts our judgment, our morality, and our skill. We have to act decisively and ethically simultaneously." The Ashen Guard's frustration was palpable. Their formations were disrupted, their strategies thwarted, and yet they pressed on with relentless determination. Each wave was stronger, faster, more aggressive. Ira realized that containment was no longer enough. They needed to think several moves ahead, anticipate not just the Guard's attacks but their adaptations, and guide the city to respond proactively, rather than reactively. Suddenly, a projection flashed across the black sphere, another moral dilemma. A secondary corridor showed civilians trapped near the edge of a collapsing platform, while the Guard's boats were advancing toward a critical archive chamber. Acting to save the civilians could compromise the archives. Prioritizing the archives could endanger lives. Ira's mind raced, calculating probabilities, ethical implications, and tactical responses in a dizzying cascade. "Torin, Kale, Lysa," she said, voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "we make the choice together. We prioritize lives first, knowledge second. The city will adjust, and we will guide it. This is the test of the Order: protect life, but preserve what we must for the future." The platforms shifted, water walls rose, and light barriers enveloped the civilians. Simultaneously, bridges rotated to isolate the Ashen Guard's vessels and redirect them away from critical archives. The city's intelligence flowed seamlessly through her decisions, translating moral clarity into strategic advantage. Every vessel, every drone, every soldier was contained without direct harm, demonstrating the fusion of ethics and strategy in real time. Kale exhaled, eyes wide. I've never seen anything like this. It's like watching intelligence and morality fight together, and we're the conductors." Ira's pulse steadied as the immediate threat passed, though distant shadows indicated reinforcements still approached. She realized that the first wave of the full-scale assault had been survived, but the true battle was far from over. The city had revealed its power, its intelligence, and its moral code, but the Ashen Guard would adapt, escalate, and push boundaries that had not yet been tested. Lysa, still trembling, whispered, "The city, it responds to us, but it's also testing us. Every choice, every action." "Yes," Ira said softly, her eyes fixed on the approaching shadows. "And the real test is only beginning. We've survived the first moral and strategic crucible, but what comes next will challenge not just our skills, but our judgment, our courage, and our understanding of what it truly means to bear the Order's legacy." The floating city pulsed beneath them, alive, aware, and anticipating. Beyond the mist, the Ashen Guard's commanders adjusted their strategy, unaware that every movement was already accounted for, already being responded to, and that the living intelligence of the city and the moral guidance of its bearers was shaping the battlefield in ways they could never predict.